Good evening, everybody. I suppose a military lecture should get started on time. Somebody told me. But good evening, my name is James Compton, and on behalf of the History Department here at the University of Montana, I'd like to welcome you to the 2024 Arnold Swanberg Lecture in Military History. This annual lecture series, spanning some 13 years, is due to the generosity of Mr. Arnold Swanberg, a UM history alumnus who is deeply committed to the betterment of our flagship university, its students, and the community it serves. Arnold, unfortunately, could not be with us here this evening, but I'd ask you to please join me in a round of applause and recognition of his longstanding support of this great event. And I promised I would send him the video of this anyway, so we'll definitely do that. We're fortunate this evening to welcome one of the most accomplished and influential modern military historians to the great state of Montana, Dr. Ronald H. Spector. Dr. Spector is currently Professor Emeritus at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And over his storied career, he has taught at numerous universities across the globe, from Alabama to Singapore, Princeton to Kyoto, LSU to National War College, Army War College, and of course the most important one, the United States Naval Academy, although I might be slightly biased in that regard. A prolific author, Professor Spector has published 9 books and numerous scholarly articles centering on 20th century military history, with a particular emphasis upon Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia. My own personal engagement with Professor Spector's work began as a young student living in Havre, Montana, when I checked out Eagle Against the Sun from the Havre Public Library. I wanted to learn personally more about the Pacific War, and learn I did. And I quickly found myself enthralled with his seamless blending of high strategy and inter-service rivalry, all coupled with the soldiers' experience on the ground. It was therefore no surprise that it won the Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt Prize for Naval History, and it remains, in my humble opinion, the single best volume written on the Pacific War. Incidentally, it also did cost me a little bit in late charges, but I think I'm paid up, at least I think so. In 2012, in recognition for his many contributions to the field of military history, Professor Spector was recognized with the Samuel Eliot Morrison Prize. And published in 2022, his most recent book, the cover of which you can see here on the slide, A Continent Erupts, engages with the tumultuous 10-year period following the conclusion of the Second World War. And we're fortunate this evening to dive into a portion of that recent analysis with tonight's lecture, titled The Improbable Survival of Chiang Kai-shek, 1948 to 1949. So ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm Montana welcome to Professor Ronald H. Spector.
Thank you very much, and very pleased to be here and appreciate being invited for the Swanberg lecture, especially during the month when the weather is best here. So, how's that? Better? Okay. All right. During my earliest years, we lived in Pittsburgh with my grandparents. Like many families where the husband was about to be drafted or had been drafted already, my mother moved in with her in-laws. And we were still there for a number of years after the war. Housing, as you know, if you're a historian, housing was very tight. And I enjoyed living there very much because my grandparents were there. Sometimes my grandmother would go through the big picture magazines, Life and Look, with me while we both sat in her big chair. And I recall seeing an article with large photos of what appeared to be soldiers in American uniforms fighting somewhere in Asia. This was about 1948 or 1949. "I thought the war was over, Grandma," I said. My grandmother said, "No, they're still fighting over there." "But why?" "I thought the war was over." And she said, "'Cause they're crazy, that's why." To many Americans at the time, my grandmother's answer would have seemed perfectly reasonable. The defeat of the Axis had brought peace to Europe, a general peace that lasted over 75 years. In contrast, events in Asia must have appeared almost incomprehensible to Americans. By October of 1947, when the first American ships carrying the coffins of American GIs for reburial in their hometowns reached the U.S., most of the regions of Asia that Americans had fought to liberate were once again at war, either against their former colonial masters or internally against each other, sometimes both at the same time. So the first decade following the end of World War II that came to be known to Europeans and Americans as the beginning of the Cold War was in fact a period of hot war in East and Southeast Asia. And of course, that's what my book is about. During this violent decade, almost all of the countries of East and Southeast Asia that had formerly been colonies of the Europeans or conquests of the Japanese became independent but divided states. North and South Vietnam, the PRC in Taiwan, North and South Korea. And in the course of their emancipation, the people of these former colonies and foreign-dominated areas split into rival factions and movements. All of these movements had claims to legitimacy in their new nation, but they were mostly unwilling to recognize the claims of other people who were also citizens of those nations. So the result was civil war in China and Korea. And I also argue in the book that the anti-colonial wars in Indonesia and Indochina had many of the characteristics of civil wars. No one can say for certain how many died during this violent decade in Asia, but two respected demographers concluded in 2005 that the greatest battle violence of the past 50 years took place in China, Korea, and the Indo-Chinese Peninsula. About 2.5 million combatants lost their lives in the Chinese Civil War, about 800,000 in the Korean War, about 400,000 in the French War in Indochina, and about 50,000 in Indonesia. These figures refer only to combatant deaths. Civilian deaths are harder to estimate, but there is a general agreement that they were much higher, perhaps 8 to 16 million in China, 5 million in Korea, 300,000 in the Indonesian War of Independence. Historians haven't agreed about really how to understand these wars. Some authors treat them as an aspect of the developing Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Certainly that's the way the Korean War and the Chinese Civil War were often regarded in the U.S., even though the two great powers had little involvement in the outbreak of either of those wars. Other authors see these conflicts as part of the opening chapters in the long narrative of decolonization, which continued into the 1950s and 60s. The well-known author and essayist Pankaj Mishra called them the interconnected struggles against white supremacy. So there's a tendency to see these conflicts in black and white, colonial powers versus anti-colonialists, communists versus non-communists, U.S. clients and allies versus Soviet clients and allies. But my approach in this book is to try to complicate this picture, to see it in technical color, so to speak, rather than in black and white. So one of the things I argue is that far from being simply struggles against white supremacy, the antagonists in the first decade of decolonization drew recruits from diverse racial and ethnic communities. If we take the war against the French in Indochina as an example, in one sense it was a struggle against white supremacy. The French and their government were white. Their opposition, the Viet Minh, were not. However, about 30% of the French Expeditionary Corps was made up of Vietnamese and Laotians. An almost equal proportion of the Expeditionary Corps were troops from the French colonies in the Maghreb and West Africa. There were also auxiliaries, or supplétifs, as the French called them. These were mainly drawn from the highland tribes of Indochina and also from Cambodians and from the two large Vietnamese religious communities, the Hoa Hao and the Cao Dai. These soldiers here are actually Cao Dai, and they were recruited and armed and paid by the French. In return, the Cao Dai, which was a kind of political religious sect, it had its own pope, and it predominated in several provinces of South Vietnam. The Cao Dai were allowed to run their own affairs and pretty much received autonomy from the French. There was also the French Foreign Legion, which had a good proportion of Nazis and SS veterans. So altogether, in 1951, of 230,000 soldiers in the French Expeditionary Corps, only 64,000 were French. This is a soldier of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army. As you can see, he doesn't look Dutch. He's actually recruited from the Dutch colonies in the West Indies. But here again, it's an example of how the colonial powers actually used people from the colonies to fight on their side. The Viet Minh didn't have a foreign legion but they did have between 600 and 700 former Japanese troops who stayed behind to fight alongside the Viet Minh. These experienced fighters who often brought their weapons with them, were of tremendous help to the Viet Minh in the early days of the war with the French, because they were able to train Viet Minh recruits and also especially train them on various types of weapons. In the Dutch East Indies, Japanese forces cooperated with the British Commonwealth forces that had been sent after the Japanese surrender to reoccupy the area and help the Dutch restore their regime. But there were also excuse me, a large number of deserters from the Japanese forces who trained and fought with the Indonesian forces fighting for independence against the Dutch. And even today, in Japan, there's a kind of alumni association of former Japanese soldiers, most of them are getting pretty old, who fought for independence in the Netherlands Indies after the war. During the Chinese Civil War, both the nationalist and communist forces competed to recruit or conscript Japanese military officers and specialists such as mechanics, tank drivers, artillerymen, and engineers from the surrendered Japanese forces. So observing all these developments, one might be tempted to say that in certain parts of Asia, the war never ended. Everybody just changed sides. As far as being a product of the developing Cold War between the U.S. and the USSR, it is safe to say that neither of the great powers was directly involved in causing these conflicts. Instead, the great powers, U.S. and USSR, were actively courted by the warring powers after the wars had started. Chiang Kai-shek looked to the U.S. for help. Mao Zedong's Chinese communists looked to the Soviets for assistance, even though they got very little. Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh received considerable help from the People's Republic of China, but only 3 years after their war with the French had begun. And by then, the French had dragged in the Americans on their side. Historians have also noted how it was Kim Il-sung who eventually sold Stalin on the idea of an invasion of South Korea, not the other way around. It was widely believed in the U.S. In 1950 that North Korea had invaded South Korea because Stalin told them to do so. So my book is primarily an examination of these post-war wars. And I argue that whatever else decolonization was, its nature, duration, and outcomes were significantly influenced by events on the battlefield, whether those events were well-known battles like the Dien Bien Phu, or whether they were characterized by patterns of irregular warfare, terrorism, and massacre spread over entire provinces or regions. So the book is 450 pages long. I don't think that all of you have quite finished it at this point, or even more shocking that some of you have not even bought it yet in the bookstores. I guess you're waiting for the movie. So I don't think I can summarize the whole 450 pages for you, but let me give you one example of one of the most important campaigns you probably never heard of, to show how the nature and outcome of these wars continues to influence events today. Okay, and in this case, I want to talk about the improbable survival of Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of China during the war against Japan. If you want to see an example of how my grandmother was absolutely right, that they're crazy over there, you can look at these two guys, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong. Very few people in China in 1945 having suffered the death of many of their relatives and friends, and many hundred thousands having been displaced and impoverished. The last thing that anybody wanted was another war, except these two guys. They were determined to fight it out to the very end, which they did. And in the end, as you know, the nationalists the nationalists lost the war, but only after killing off between them even more hundreds of thousands of people. So how did the nationalists lose? President Truman had a simple explanation. He said in a letter to a friend that Chiang Kai-shek had the most corrupt government since Nero. The so-called China lobby, which was made up mainly of Republicans friendly to Chiang Kai-shek and opposed to Truman, argued that Chiang Kai-shek was betrayed by here in the U.S. by pro-communists or communist dupes in the State Department and Army, and that's why the nationalists lost the war. That view was very popular in the 1950s. It led to the ruin of many careers in the federal bureaucracy. Some historians in the last decade or so argue that really Chiang Kai-shek was not in such an advantageous position as Americans thought. His regime had never recovered from the catastrophic blows of the 8-year struggle with Japan. It was in very poor shape, and it needed peace above everything else. But of course, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, as we'll see in a minute, were just determined to continue their struggle for supremacy. In August of 1945, it appeared that Chiang Kai-shek was really in the driver's seat. He was widely credited for victory over the Japanese in China. He had just signed the so-called Sino-Soviet Treaty in August of 1945, which made huge concessions in China and territorially to the Soviet Union, but in turn, the Soviet Union recognized Chiang Kai-shek's regime as the sole legitimate government of China. And Chiang Kai-shek continued to enjoy strong political and material support by the U.S., including a program to sell the nationalist government surplus American weapons and civilian equipment. At the beginning of the Civil War, the nationalist armies had about 3.5 times as many troops as the communists. Plus, the nationalists had tanks and aircraft supplied by the U.S. The communists had none. So at the beginning of the war, Chiang Kai-shek forces were moved by U.S. sea and airlift to reoccupy 17 major cities, and many of the formerly communist-occupied areas in northeast China and also in southern and central China during the fall of 1945 and early 1946. Well, as I mentioned, World War II had resulted in enormous economic destruction and disruption in Chinese society. The great majority of Chinese desired peace. President Truman sent General George C. Marshall, the former Chief of Staff of the Army, to the Chiang Kai-shek's capital at Nanjing to try to avert civil war by working out an agreement between the communists and Chiang Kai-shek. Marshall also visited Yunnan, the communist capital. However, as I mentioned, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong are each determined to fight it out to the end, so that even though they, for a short time, seemed to agree to a settlement worked out by Marshall, in the end, in a few months, they were back fighting again. And the immediate cause of the renewed fighting was the province of Manchuria, which the Chinese now call the Northeast. Manchuria, of course, you probably remember from your history courses, had been occupied, and it was a puppet state of the Japanese from 1932 on. Manchuria had important agricultural and industrial resources. It could grow enormous amounts of food, and the Japanese had invested quite a bit in the industrial development of Manchuria. So both the nationalists and the communists felt that this was an area that they couldn't let the other side take over. At first, things really favored Chiang Kai-shek. During 1946, the communists lost control of 174,000 square kilometers of territory in North China and Manchuria, including 165 towns that they had taken control of during or immediately after the war. The communists also lost the key railway junction of Siping, as well as a much larger city of Changchun. And by the summer of 1946, the communists had been pushed all the way back to the northernmost city of Harbin, almost on the border with the Soviet Union. And then in March of 1945, the nationalist general Hu Zongnan captures Yunnan, the communist capital. So it looks like Chiang Kai-shek is going to wrap things up in a very short time. But the tide of the war was already beginning to turn. And in 1948 and 49, the nationalists suffered a series of catastrophic defeats in Manchuria in the so-called Lao Shen campaign from September to November of 1948. General Lin Bao's Northeast Army decisively defeated Chiang Kai-shek's forces in Manchuria. That defeat cost the nationalists about 500,000 troops, including some of the best American-trained divisions that the Americans had trained during World War II and had fought in Burma. In the fall of 1948 into the beginning of 1949, Chiang Kai-shek forces were again defeated in the so-called Weihai campaign, centering around the city of Suzhou on the North China Plain. The nationalists lost over 500,000 troops, including thousands who voluntarily defected to the communist side. Well, Chiang Kai-shek, after this, resigned in January of 1949. The communists went on to capture Beijing in that same month. And then in April of 1949, communist forces crossed the Yangtze River, capturing the nationalist capital at Nanjing. October 1949, Mao Zedong proclaims the People's Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek, who, even though he resigned, was still in charge, moves with the nationalist government to the island of Taiwan. And it looks like things would soon be up for the nationalists. One of the reasons for, or among the reasons for the nationalist defeat was that nationalist generals, some of them were very able, some of them were wildly incompetent, but they didn't cooperate or trust each other. Many of them were former warlords or were loyal to former warlords. Also, Chiang Kai-shek himself often interfered in operations, issuing ill-advised or nonsensical orders. And as we've seen already, there were widespread defections to the communists. And among other things, there were large-scale losses of equipment to the communists. A lot of times the defecting troops would bring their weapons with them, or because of widespread corruption in the nationalist government, a lot of times the communists were just able to buy weapons from the nationalists. Also, nationalist soldiers were treated very badly, neglected and abused. Many times they would suffer from debilitating diseases, and so it was understandable that they would want to, if they had a chance to defect or desert, that they would do so. There were other non-military causes of the nationalist defeat. One of them was hyperinflation. The value of the Chinese currency continued to drop until it got to a situation where prices were rising so fast that people in the cities would put their wages in big wheelbarrows or carts and take them over to the store before prices went up again. There is also widespread corruption in the nationalist government. The nationalists never paid any attention to the rural areas of China, and of course that's where the strength of the communists was. And the communists had superior organization and propaganda. Also, the nationalist government and army was thoroughly penetrated by agents of the Chinese Communist Party, and those agents, in many cases, would arrange the defection of troops to the communist side. As I mentioned, there were the causes. I think we have the slides backwards, but anyway, the cause of this hyperinflation was that the Chinese army at the end of World War II was way too large, but there was no demobilization, so that there was no chance of developing civilian industries and providing jobs for discharged soldiers. The railroads continued to be used by the military, so they couldn't help in the economic development, redevelopment of China. There was no revival of foreign trade, and there was actually a shrinking tax base because as the communists captured more territory, there was less and less territory to tax to pay the expenses of the nationalist government. So the result was this hyperinflation. During 1947, prices in Shanghai, for instance, increased 700%. There's been a lot of talk in the presidential campaign about inflation and what we should do about it and how it's a major problem. Well, you can imagine, how about if prices increase 700% this year? Then you might feel you had really a problem. And on February 1947, the black market rate for $1 was 7,800 yuan. By February 8th, 1 week later, it was 11,500 yuan. So you can see how the hyperinflation was proceeding. Well, as I mentioned, the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek had moved to Taiwan, along with everything else he could get there. Many people who didn't want to live under the communists tried to migrate to Taiwan. Chiang took everything with him he could. He emptied out the major museums. He also emptied out the gold in the Bank of China. And of course, Mao Zedong felt that Chiang Kai-shek holding out on Taiwan was insufferable, that meant that all of China had not been liberated. And so he ordered General Su Yu, one of the architects of the victory at the Weihai battle, to prepare for an invasion of Taiwan. Su Yu had just captured the important port of Shanghai, and now the first step in the invasion of Taiwan was to capture the island of Kinmen, or Quemoy, as it was called then. You can see Quemoy here. It's that little speck there right near Xiamen. It's only about 10 miles from the Chinese mainland, and it was considered that that would be essential to a Chinese communist invasion of Taiwan. Su Yu assigned the 28th Army to take Quemoy. The 28th Army had no amphibious experience. They had never carried out an overwater invasion. They would have to go in junks, many of them sail-powered. There would be no naval or air cover because the communists didn't have any navy or air force. And there would be no artillery support after the landing because the communists also didn't have any radios or planes to spot for them. And because of the peculiar tides at Quemoy, they could only land at night. But they had no good hydrographic information. They didn't have many experienced boatmen. Many of the captains of the junks had not been in these waters before. So all in all, Su Yu decided it was a good idea to postpone the invasion until at least he could get junks to carry 20,000 men. But he was overruled by Mao Zedong, who wanted to complete the unification of China as soon as possible. So that when the invasion came, bad weather carried most of the invading junks past the landing point, and instead many of the troops landed near a town called Guningdao. And it just happened that the spot where they landed, they were in the spot where they landed, they ran into a platoon of tanks. And that was because the tanks had been practicing during the day, and one of them broke down. The other three were ordered to stay on the beach and help get the injured tank back the next day. So when the Chinese communists came ashore, many of them found that they were confronting these 4 tanks. In addition, there was an LST of the Chinese Navy recently given to China by the U.S., and the LST was on the beach because it was waiting, like many ships in the Chinese Navy, it was engaged in widespread smuggling, and I think it was sugar, refined sugar, that the LST was supposed to take back to the mainland wasn't ready yet. So that the LST, the Chunlung, stayed on the beach that night and used the excuse of bad weather for not sailing. Now, this particular LST still carried all of the anti-aircraft guns, and including 40-millimeter guns and a few 5-inch guns that had been installed by the Americans during the war to deal with kamikazes, so that when the Chunlung opened fire, there was a great deal of firepower directed at the communists coming ashore. Reinforcements from the mainland couldn't be sent because there were only a few junks left. the junks that had carried the invasion force were supposed to come back and pick up the reinforcements, but of course they couldn't. And when daybreak came, nationalist aircraft from Taiwan came and blew up, bombed, and strafed the junks remaining on the shore. So there was no way to get reinforcements from, to get large-scale reinforcements from the mainland. After 4 days, the last communist soldiers surrendered. The communists had lost over 4,000 troops and had 5,000 taken prisoner. The nationalists lost about 1,200, and of course the nationalists had stopped the attempted invasion of Quemoy and made the invasion of Taiwan impossible for the time being. Well, while the nationalists were still celebrating the victory on Quemoy, President Truman's National Security Council advised him to warn Chiang Kai-shek that the U.S. was not going to commit troops to the defense of Taiwan. Most of Truman's advisors were convinced that Chiang Kai-shek was a complete loser, that any military equipment supplied to him would just end up in the hands of the enemy, and further economic aid would probably be useless also, so that in the end, the Secretary of State drafted a note to Chiang Kai-shek explaining to him that the U.S. would not be responsible for the defense of Taiwan, and any further American economic aid would depend on the performance of the nationalists in ridding themselves of corruption and instituting reforms. And this was supposed to be a warning to Chiang Kai-shek that the U.S. was going to wash its hands of him. But weirdly enough, Chiang Kai-shek takes this as good news, because it says there that if he cleans up his act, the U.S. would continue economic aid. So he invites the American consul, who had to read the note aloud to Chiang Kai-shek, he invites him to dinner, and he calls in all his top officials and reads them the message and says, see, the U.S. hasn't deserted us. The U.S. is still supporting us. And so in its weird way, this attempt by Truman to get rid of Chiang Kai-shek sort of backfires. Of course, there was still the communists, and Mao Zedong was determined to get Taiwan, to unify China. In 1949-1950, the communists complete their conquest of China, and General Su Yu decides that it has to be done right this time, and he begins a program to acquire foreign shipping and repair nationalist warships so that when the invasion of Quemoy comes again, that there won't be any failures. And he was preparing for a 1951 attack on Taiwan that would involve 1 million communist troops. But before that could take place, North Korea attacks South Korea, and the invasion is off. The People's Republic of China eventually enters the Korean War And so there is no attack on Quemoy and no invasion of China. I'm sorry, no invasion of Taiwan. And so we still have Taiwan with us today, and Congress is still fighting about it. And I think there was just recent legislation passed about the security of Taiwan, and this all took place because of a few tanks and an LST that happened to be on the beach at Guningdao on Quemoy in 1948. Okay, I'm going to end there and see if you have any questions.
Go grab a microphone. Wait.
Is there any way that the United States could have done a deal with Mao that would have fundamentally changed what happened in the 1950s?
Could have done a deal with Mao when?
I think in the 1950s, I believe.
Oh, during the 1950s. Once there was a kind of delegation, an observer delegation sent during the war to Yunnan. It was called the Dixie Mission, and to observe the communists. And there was talk among some Americans in China about arming the communists because they seemed to be doing a better job of fighting the Chinese. Of course, they were fighting the Chinese on a guerrilla basis. Chiang Kai-shek's army had borne the brunt of the whole war against China in eastern China. But to the Americans, it looked like the Chinese communists were much more capable, much more enthusiastic about fighting the Japanese than the nationalists were. But the proposal didn't go anywhere.
I actually have a question. Your last slide suggests a counterfactual that if the Korean War hadn't erupted, that the communists would have taken Taiwan in fairly short order. Is that something that you would argue?
Yes, I think most people would agree with that. I mean, it's possible they would have had a harder time than they expected. One of the reasons that the nationalists were successful at holding Quemoy was the soldiers who were fighting there were recruited from Taiwan. They had never had to fight the Japanese or the Chinese communists, so they were sort of gung-ho and more enthusiastic than they should have been. And they suffered heavy casualties, but you could argue that maybe the rest of the Taiwanese could be recruited. On the other hand, the nationalist regime in these early years on Taiwan was quite oppressive. There was a bloody uprising in 46 or 47. So I think that the odds are that the communists would have had an easy time with the conquest of Taiwan.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess, here, we'll go over to you. And if you don't mind maybe introducing yourself as well.
Hi, I'm Aiden. I'm a student here. I was wondering, is there any credence to the arguments made by the China lobby and the Republicans in Congress at the time that if the United States just committed more resources and sent more aid to Chiang Kai-shek, then the nationalists could have won? Is there any credence to that, or do you think it would have just
Well, the
been
problem
lost?
was And General Marshall mentioned this in one of the meetings with the Chinese ambassador. He said, the more equipment we send, the more that is captured or sold to the communists. And so we end up arming the communists more than to a greater extent than we're arming Chiang Kai-shek.
Sorry about that.
I'm Carter. I'm a student here, and I was wondering do you think if the U.S. did get rather involved in this much more than they already did, how differently would things have played out?
You were talking about right now?
Yeah. No, back in what you were just presenting back in the 50s.
And could you repeat your question?
Do you think if the U.S. got involved with Chiang Kai-shek and China back then more than they did, do you think how differently do you think things would have played out?
Oh, well, they did. I mean, they tried to support Chiang Kai-shek right up to almost the end. But once he had thrown in the towel and moved to Taiwan, they just decided they couldn't do it. There were many people in the media and in Congress that said, well, we can still, he can come back. We can aid parts of China that aren't under communist control. Of course, the communists eventually rolled over those areas too. But yeah, there was a strong, it was called the China Lobby. It was made up of some were former missionaries, some were just people who hated the Democrats and hated Truman, wanted to get him out of office. And there was concern in general about what appeared to be the sort of march of communism. They had taken over large areas of Eastern Europe, and so there was a fear, well, now they're going to take over all of Asia. And they had succeeded in taking over the largest country in Asia, a country that had been a strong U.S. ally before that.
Hi, my name's Keeley. I'm a student here. My question is, why did the CCP opt to help the North Koreans instead of bypassing that and invading Taiwan instead?
Oh, because once the Americans crossed the 38th parallel, the Koreans were retreating and their army was in pretty bad shape. And it looked like they would go all the way to the Yalu River, all the way to the border of China. So the Chinese felt that they couldn't tolerate the presence of American troops right on the border of China, and also North Korea was an ally, was part of the socialist camp. And even though Mao Zedong had doubts about the invasion of South Korea, unlike Stalin just believed everything that Kim Il-sung told him. Kim Il-sung said, oh, it'll be over in 3 weeks. The Americans won't have time to come in and blah, blah, blah. Mao Zedong never believed that. And so almost from the beginning, he was starting to think about the possibility that China would have to come into the war. He sent one of his strategic planners to North Korea to see how things were going, and his planner came back and said things are pretty awful for the North Koreans, and plus the Americans can carry out even more amphibious landings because they control of the seas on both sides of the peninsula.
Hello, my name is Henry. I'm also a student here. My question, and this goes perhaps a little bit beyond the scope of what you talked about, could you discuss briefly how Taiwan went from being a relatively authoritarian, somewhat undeveloped state in the 1950s under Chiang Kai-shek to now, we're in the 21st century, it's very industrialized and considered a very vibrant democracy, how that gap was bridged over the last several decades?
Yeah, that's, I can't explain that exactly either. One thing was that Chiang Kai-shek did carry out pretty thorough reforms on Taiwan. He brought Taiwanese into the civil government at lower levels, and there was a huge land reform that was carried out, and it was educational reforms. And there were a lot of opportunities for Taiwanese. A lot of the mainlanders were still in the army, and so a lot of the Taiwanese developed the businesses and educational institutions and so on. So that's one thing. So this very thoroughgoing reform by American-trained nationalist officials on Taiwan. At the same time, the government was extremely repressive. The secret police was very active. But eventually, it evolves into what we have today.
I'm just going to ask one more question. To me, the most interesting thing about your talk was that you make two, I think, really strong arguments for historical contingency. The first one being the kind of chance that brought those tanks, and the ship there. The other one being, and this one was a little bit less strong, but the fact that Chiang Kai-shek interprets this missive as continued U.S. support. And the first one, it seems clear you're saying this was chance. The second one, I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about the motivation behind that, because I can see you kind of left it open, but I could imagine a world where this is him misunderstanding, or this is a creative misunderstanding, and he says, shoot, the U.S. is abandoning me. I need to put the best face on this to try to get their continued support. I'm just curious, which of those...
And again, the Korean War affects the nationalist government, too, because in a number of ways, first of all, it saves them from the CCP, but at the same time, the U.S. spends a lot of money in Taiwan, just as it does in Japan, and also a large number of Chinese interpreters who work for the UN command as interpreters in the prison camps are recruited by the Americans, and many of these people are connected with the secret police and the intelligence service on Taiwan, and their main job is to recruit communist soldiers who are prisoners, get them to say they want to go to Taiwan. And many of them had just been recruited into the army in 1949, so it didn't take much persuasion in those cases to get them to come over. And so this is a kind of windfall for Chiang Kai-shek. He gets all these young, relatively young, able-bodied people to come to Taiwan, and they contribute to the economic development of the island.
So you talked about, sorry, I'm Gavin. I'm also a student here on campus. You talked about the distrust between the generals in the Nationalist Army. Other than political maneuvering, was there any direct action taken between these generals?
Well, no, you didn't. You didn't have any instances like you had in the early 20th century up through the 1920s, where you have one warlord that's trying to do it another warlord. But at the same time, a lot of these warlords don't necessarily trust the other guy, and they don't necessarily want to cooperate with them. Sometimes if Chiang Kai-shek wants them to go somewhere to fight the Japanese, they're afraid of abandoning their stronghold in whatever province they're in. So they're not completely reliable.
Me again. So, I was wondering what the because you said the Soviets didn't really support the communists during the Chinese Civil War. What was the strategic calculation of Stalin behind that? Why?
They don't support them much because the Soviets had just signed this treaty with Chiang Kai-shek that says we recognize you as the sole government of China. So the support from the Soviets in the first years of the Civil War is not a whole lot. A lot of times they will turn over captured Japanese weapons to the communists. That was their main contribution during the first years of the war. Towards the end of the last year or two of the Civil War, they do accept some communist technicians to be trained in China. They also allow them to use the Soviet railroad system on the borders of China to move their stuff around, but they don't give them a huge amount of support. Oh, because Stalin, first of all, Stalin never thought the Chinese communists were going to win. But the other reason was that Stalin got all kinds of concessions from the nationalist government. The nationalists basically gave him all of the concessions that it had originally made to the Japanese in 1905. Stalin sort of took them over. So the Soviets take over Port Arthur and these other places in China that they want, and the Soviets can buy Chinese resources on favorable terms and so on.
Hi, Dr. Spector. This
Hi.
is Michael,
Hi.
PhD student. Nice to see you again. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the memory of the Chinese Civil War, or rather how it's taught today. Because when we think about civil wars, we think about triumphant narratives, one ideology crushing the other. But from your presentation, it almost sounds like both sides were equally inept. So I was just curious if you could touch on that. Do they talk about failures on the communist side when teaching the Chinese Civil War, or do they have a different kind of story?
Yeah, I think in China, the Chinese histories are pretty accurate, except they leave out certain things. Like in the case of of the Quemoy campaign, it'll say, okay, General Su Yu wanted to delay the invasion, and it gives a reason he wanted to, but it just said, but he was turned down. It doesn't mention it's Mao Zedong who messes everything up by saying, go ahead and do this right away. So there's still some. It's not 100% accurate, but it's pretty good. Both sides' histories of the Civil War are pretty accurate. And the other thing, though, that happened in China, this was before Xi Jinping, but during the during the Reagan administration, when there's a commemoration of World War II. Can't remember which anniversary it was, but anyway, the communists, for the first time, concede that Chiang Kai-shek did a lot of fighting to fight the Japanese. And there's even, if you go to Manchuria, the house of the former warlord of Manchuria, who resisted the Japanese, his house is sort of a memorial museum. So he's considered a hero, even though he always fought on the side of Chiang Kai-shek. He's considered a hero of the resistance against the Japanese. So it's a much more nuanced view than it would have been under Mao Zedong.
What are your observations on the role of Madam Chiang Kai-shek during this time period?
Madam Chiang Kai-shek was extremely influential. She visited the U.S., I think, excuse me, 3 times during the war. She was invited to address a joint session of Congress. Of course, she spoke perfect English. She was a graduate of Wellesley College. So she was extremely popular in the U.S., but even she couldn't sell this ticket on a sinking ship that she tried to do.
Thanks. I'm Jody. I'm a professor here of social history. And I was fascinated by your slide that said most people coming out of the war wanted peace, but the war happened because Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong wanted war, wanted that war. And that made me think about Leo Tolstoy's second epilogue to War and Peace, when he talks about, Napoleon ordered people to go and rape and pillage, and they all did, and he's really questioning the power of leadership to mobilize. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit. I mean, I assume that Chiang Kai-shek had mandatory military conscription, and that's sort of what brought about a lot of the desertion, was that people were not mobilized to fight for him. But then Mao has to have recruited people who wanted to fight for him, or were they coerced? I mean, what was the nature of the relationship between orders being given at the top and those on the bottom who were following through with them on either or both sides?
Well, the Nationalist Army was supplied with recruits by, you could call them press gangs. They came around, and when they would visit a town or a district, they would tell the district chief, okay, we need 4 guys from your district. So the chief would round up 4 guys and say, oh, sorry, you're going into the Army. And they would say, no, is there any way we can get out of the Army? Well, if your family can pay us some money, you don't have to go into the Army. So then he'd round up 4 more guys who weren't quite as rich, but maybe they could pay their way. So you get down to the person, the 4 who can't pay anything, and those are the guys who are going into the Army. And it takes place very quickly, and there's not much you can do. The press gangs are armed, so you could try to run away. That's about your best chance. But other than that, that's how they were recruited. The communists supposedly had a volunteer army, but they would, when they carried out these programs of land reform in various places, they would say things like, well, now you own this land, but you got to protect it. The nationalists will be back to take your land away. You'd better send your 2 sons to serve in our army, so we'll keep the nationalists away. And then there were other people who just joined the communists because they were idealistic and so on. But normally they were recruited. The recruits came from rural areas rather than the cities. And the officers came from the ranks. So a unit would, if they needed more officers, a unit would nominate certain people. And then the party would screen them to see who they wanted to take. And ideally, what the party wanted is somebody who had the equivalent of a high school education. There weren't that many of them, but at least somebody who had the equivalent of 5 or 6 years of schooling. They were almost always, whether they wanted to be or not, they were going to be picked up as officers.
I do a couple more questions.
My name is Matthew. I just had a question about when you look at the rest of the basically the rest of the century. We were more than happy to get involved in other people's revolutions when pushing back communism. Now I get that Truman had a very different mindset than Eisenhower did, but if say Eisenhower was in office and was willing to commit a fighting force to check, excuse me. Do you think that, I mean, we wouldn't have had the same issues in North Korea? Do you think that there's any credence to that?
Eisenhower had run on a platform of he was going to get us out. He was going to settle the Korean War. He never said how, but he was going to settle the Korean War. And at the same time, though, to appease all the China lobby, he signed a treaty with a defense treaty with Chiang Kai-shek. But the deal was Chiang Kai-shek had to stop provoking the CCP, and he couldn't carry out raids on the mainland anymore. And he had to agree to abandon certain island chains that were vulnerable and so on. And what Eisenhower wanted and one of his advisors had wanted, they didn't have a great opinion of Chiang Kai-shek either. They just wanted to keep him out of a war with the mainland.
All right, I think we probably have time for one more question. Michael, did you have? Yep, I think it's you.
Changing topics slightly, because I was just interested. I came in as you were discussing your book earlier on, and I was fascinated you talking about the role of the Japanese military during these independence movements in the 1940s, because typically when we learn about the history of the Japanese Empire, it's an expansive and brutal force, and the Japanese co-prosperity sphere claimed to be liberating East Asia from the Western powers, but it was truly a change of management, so to speak. So it's interesting to hear about Japanese soldiers actually fighting for independence of these new nations. So I was just wondering if I could hear you talk about like this weird philosophy of Japanese soldiers being an empire, but also liberators, and how you reconcile those two things.
Yeah, well, it was of course, a very small percentage of Japanese soldiers who stayed behind. None of them were above the rank of lieutenant. And the Japanese Demobilization Bureau, when these guys came back, a lot of them came back by 47, 48, interviewed them, and they asked them why they had stayed on. The most common reason was they had married local women and they wanted to stay. Another reason was they didn't see any economic future for themselves in Japan. Another reason were, on the part of a lot of them, is they thought they may be tried as war criminals. That they had good reason to to think that there's a newspaper article in Japanese, a kind of memoir by a Japanese soldier who stayed behind to fight in Indonesia, and the head of his unit had been a member of the Japanese secret police, was a complete fascist, and this soldier happened to be a socialist, but they still got along, and then the socialist soldier admired his leader, who was expert at planting bombs. As a matter of fact, he was killed while planting a bomb, but the Indonesians made up a story that he had died heroically fighting the Dutch. So there was various people who had various, besides being idealistic and wanting to fight for Greater East Asia, the majority of stay-behinds had other motives for staying behind.
All right, thank you so much. If we can just give Professor Spector another round of applause. And thank you all for coming.